Okay, now we're going to add our blanket stitch edging, and I'm going to use, as I mentioned, let me find the one that I like better, my bent tip needle. Depending on what size you got, these are great because they have a bigger eye and they're easier to see. However, they're a little less sharp, so harder to push through layers. So if this is your very first time, you may find this needle a little bit easier to work with, even though it's harder to thread. So we're going to take just about a yard of yarn to start with. Yes, we could use a huge piece of yarn and get the blanket stitch around our entire project in one try, but if it's your first time doing the blanket stitch, most likely what's going to happen is you're going to end up with a big tangled mess of yarn. So let's not do that. So we're going to thread the needle, and then we're going to tie a knot at the end, any kind of knot, leaving at least a few inches of slack on the end. And these few inches of yarn we're going to actually crochet over later, so they'll disappear, so don't worry about them or the knot. Then we're going to straighten out the rest of this yarn, and you can see it's already inclined to want to tangle itself, so it's a good thing we're not using such a long string. So we're going to start in any one of these four corners, and we're going to kind of use our needle to get in there in the seam. So we're going to be in between the front and the back piece of fabric, and what we're trying to find is our first skip cut on on the side that we're working towards. So for this action, I should say you're going to be holding the needle in your dominant hand, and your non-dominant hand is going to be doing a bunch of other jobs, and you should be moving from your dominant hand to your non-dominant hand. So I'm, for example, a right-hander, so I'm holding the needle in my right hand, I'm moving right to left. If you're a left-hander, you'll be holding your needle in your left hand. You'll be doing this a lot neater than I am, and you're going to be moving from left to right. Okay, so again, we're starting our needle in here, and we're taking it out through the front of our front pieced part of our placemat, and we're going to pull the yarn all the way through, and this is why we don't want to start with a huge piece, because you can see it's easy to get it kind of tangled because it has both layers. Okay, so what you're going to see is the knot is going to be on the outside and that extra yarn tail, and that's exactly the way we want it. And now you're going to find that same skip cut hole on the back of the fabric. Okay, and then you're going to push so that the needle is going from the back to the front through the same hole. Before you start pulling your yarn through, I want you to take the index finger on your non-dominant hand and put it between your yarn. So you have this sort of front loop, this back loop. You're going to hold your index finger, and then we're going to pull the yarn through. And you see, even with not a too long thing, it gets a little tangly, and that's okay. We're going to keep the loop on our index finger until it gets pretty small. Then we're going to put the needle through the loop on our index finger. Now we can release our index finger, and we're going to pull the yarn all the way through. Okay, so now let's go to our next skip cut piece. We probably, depending on our fabric, we might do that by feel. So you can see if I just kind of move my needle, it goes through somewhere. I don't see the hole, but apparently it's there. Same thing, I'm going to use the index finger on my non-dominant hand to hold up the yarn. And then I'm going to start pulling that yarn through. Okay, and this is what we call a blanket stitch. When it gets to the part where it's kind of tough to hold it on my index finger, then I'm going to pull the needle through, again working from the direction of my non-dominant hand away to the, working from the direction of my dominant hand to my non-dominant hand. And then I'm going to pull it through, being careful not to tangle stuff like I just almost did there. Okay, so what you'll see from this first one is that when we push through the skip cut blade, we create a little vertical line. And when we grab that stitch on our loop, that we've been holding in our index finger, we create a little horizontal line. And the little horizontal line is what is going to hold our crochet in place. So our little vertical lines are basically there for decorative purposes. So let's continue doing that. So again, you're going to be moving from your dominant hand towards your non-dominant hand. Use your needle to help you find the next skip cut. Place your index finger and then pull that yarn all the way through. Once your index finger is getting snug around there, then you're going to take the needle and pull it through that little loop, being sure not to tangle, and then you're going to pull everything tightly. Okay, and we're going to keep doing that until we get to the edge of this piece. And when we get to the edge, we're going to do something a little bit different. Now let me talk about some troubleshooting while we're here. What happens if you have one big loop and one little loop? No worries, you're just going to tug on these two strands till they kind of even out. So that's not a problem. It's even not a problem if you've already pulled the yarn, because until you make the next stitch, you have a little bit of flexibility in adjusting just by pulling these two strands apart. Where it gets troublesome is if you don't notice for a couple of stitches, but even then it's not a nightmare. So just keep going and we'll talk about how to deal with that later. So again, we're going to keep working, in my case, from right to left. If you're a lefty, from left to right. You're going to just keep working this blanket stitch across to the edge, and then I'll show you the next step from there. Actually, I fibbed. Let me show you a little troubleshooting. So here I accidentally skipped this cut in between, so you can see just from looking at them that there's just a wider space between these two stitches. If you notice this right away, you can solve it pretty quickly. If you don't notice it until later, there's a crochet way we can solve it too. But if you notice it right away, just go back to the stitch that you skipped, work your blanket stitch like normal. Okay, and being a little more careful about the tangling because it's easier to do when there's a bigger gap between the stitches. Okay, and then you're going to skip the one you just made and move on to the next one. So that'll give you still the horizontal piece. You'll have all the stitches that you're supposed to have, so it'll be evenly worked around, and nobody will know that you made that mistake because most of this is going to get covered up by crochet anyway, so it'll not really matter. That's another thing that I should mention. If you feel like your little knots are sort of tangly and they're not perfect, again, this is all going to get covered up with crochet, this whole horizontal piece, so I really wouldn't worry about it. Okay, when we get to the edge and we have our last skip cut on this side, before we turn, what are we supposed to do here? So we're still going to be making a blanket stitch, but it's going to be a little bit different. So we're going to insert from the back to the front. We're going to still be using our forefinger to kind of guide the yarn, but this time we're going to let the yarn have a little bit more slack because it's going to cover this whole edge here. So we're not going to tighten it all the way up, we're going to let it be loose like that. And then we're going to stick our needle through it again and continue working across. And we'll repeat that on each corner, so I'll do that again when we get to the next corner so you can see it a little bit better. So it's the same thing, but we're just being a little bit looser with our yarn slack so that the horizontal piece can sort of curve across the edge of our project. So while we're talking about the blanket stitch, can you use other things than yarn? Yes, some people prefer to use embroidery floss for this part. Personally, I like to be a little more cohesive with colors, so that's why I like to use the same yarn to lay down the blanket stitch as I use for the crochet patterns itself. I also find that some people, you know, you may have a machine that has a blanket stitch, and that's an option if you like to do that. There's other ways you could use actually a heavier embroidery needle that's got a sharper tip, and you could use that to push through all the 3 layers of fabric without the skip cut blade, but I find that's really straining on my hand and also pretty straining on my needles too. I find that a lot of them bend and break. I also personally am not as evenly spaced as a skip cut blade is, so when I've done that, it ends up that my project has sort of really uneven stitching on the edge, and that's why I really recommend the skip cut blades. I think they're just so much easier for this part. Like, as you can see, it's really simple to just put the stitches through. It's not sort of a nightmare. Even there on the seam, I'm not really fighting with the fabric, and that's kind of what happens when I'm using my own force to just push through rather than following the holes of the skip cut. Now, a couple things I'm going to mention. We're getting sort of close to running out of thread, and so I'm going to show you how to add a new thread. As I said, you could choose to cut a huge piece of thread, and that would probably, you'd want to take the perimeter of your project, so all of the sides, and do probably 12 times around. It ends up being a lot of yarn, and depending on how tight you pull the stitches, you may not need it all, or you may even need more anyway, and it ends up usually getting pretty tangly, which is sort of not so fun to work with. Okay, so I'm going to let us get to this, around this corner, and then we're going to cut the thread. I'll show you how to add a new one. So again, on our corner, we're going to go into the first skip cut on the following side. We're going to do everything the same, but just ever so slightly looser with this loop so that it comes around the curve of the edge. Then we'll pull it through. So we can snip the thread here, and we can create a knot here. Now again, we want to leave as much extra yarn, at least an inch or two, but probably 2 or 3 is better, on the edge here, because we're going to actually crochet over that later. So don't worry about leaving that extra knot thread. And then it looks like, for me at least, I got about halfway around. So I'm going to try to take, hopefully this is about the same length as whatever yarn I chose before. And just again to remind you, we're going to thread the needle. Then we're going to look for the other cut thread. Of our yarn. We're going to make a knot with a couple of inches to spare. And any type of knot will do. And then we're going to try to untangle by bringing our needle towards the center. Oops. Of this giant loop that we've created. Also, I should mention why I'm using 2 layers of yarn. I think it makes a sturdier placemat that stands up to being used more often. It's not required though. If you really, really want to use a thinner look, that's also fine. So I'm going to start, when I'm adding the new yarn, kind of similar to what I did when I did it before, where I came from the center, except I'm going to come from underneath the loop of the previous stitch. Okay, so again here we're going to have these 2 knots because we joined the yarn, but that's okay. Don't pull this all the way through because the knot will fly right through. Just leave it there. When we crochet over, it'll get more secure. Then I'm going to find my next skip cut, and I'm going to repeat my process of using my index finger to hold a loop in my yarn, bringing my needle through, and then pulling that across. Okay, so maybe I made this a little too loose. It's sticking out a little bit, so I can pull it forward a tiny bit because I'm still on this stitch, which means I can still adjust this thread. Okay, so there you go. That's maybe a little bit firmer. Yeah, so it's not as scary to adjust if you don't panic. As soon as you panic, the thread gets tighter. It becomes a lot harder to deal with it. So just try to remain calm. It's like, they tell you on the airplane, remain calm. Okay, so all the way across and around. And then when we're done with this, we'll go to the part where we're going to actually add the crochet stitches. Okay, so here we are all the way around. We're at our kind of last blanket stitch before our original knot. How do we finish off? We're going to put our needle under our very first blanket stitch, and we're going to pull this thread through, or the yarn through, leaving a little bit of slack like we have around every corner. And then we're going to create a knot here, as we've done at the beginning and end of every sort of yarn tail. And again, it doesn't really matter the type of knot that you choose because you're going to be crocheting over the knot anyway. And then you want to cut off, leaving a yarn tail that's a couple inches long so that we can crochet over that later. Okay, so